In 2013, I decided to meet my enemies. I was a 27-year-old award-winning documentary filmmaker and a proud feminist, and I was determined to expose the dark underbelly of the men's rights movement. At that point, all I knew of the men's rights movement was from what I read online, that it's a misogynistic hate group actively working against women's equality. And I filmed 44 people total. And there's an important rule in documentary filmmaking. As an interviewer, you do not interrupt. So I'm asking questions, and I'm getting their full life story. And in the moment, I didn't realize it. But now looking back, I can see that while I was conducting my interviews, I wasn't actually listening. I was hearing them speak, and I knew the cameras were recording. But in those moments of sitting across from my enemy, I wasn't listening. What was I doing? I was anticipating. I was waiting to hear a sentence, or even just a couple of words in succession that proved what I wanted to believe, that I had found the misogynist, the ground zero of the war on women. My initial knee-jerk reactions to certain statements weren't really warranted, and my feeling offended didn't hold up to intense scrutiny. Was that statement about men having built the skyscrapers and the bridges anti-women? I thought, well, what would be the gender reverse scenario? Maybe a feminist saying, just look around. Everyone you see was birthed by a woman. Wow, that's a powerful statement. And it's true. Is it anti-male? I would often hear an innocent and valid point that a men's rights activist would make, but in my head, I would add on to their statement a sexist or anti-woman spin, assuming that's what they wanted to say but didn't. So here are two examples of how that would go. A men's rights activist, an MRA, would say to me, there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters for women in the United States, but only one for men. Yet multiple reputable studies show that men are just as likely to be abused. I would hear them say, we don't need 2,000 shelters for women. They're all lying about being abused. It's all a scam. But in looking back on all the footage I'd gathered of men's rights activists talking about shelters, and all the blogs they've written, and the video live streams they posted on YouTube, they're not trying to defund women's shelters, not at all. All they're saying is that men can be abused too, and they deserve care and compassion. Where is justice for the man who was falsely accused of raping a woman? And because of this accusation, he loses his college scholarship and is branded with the inescapable title of rapist. I would hear them say, a woman being raped isn't a big deal. It's as if I didn't hear the word falsely accused of rape. All I heard was he was accused of rape. Of course, rape is a big deal, and all the men's rights activists I met agreed it is a horrible thing to have happened to anyone. I eventually realized what they're saying is they're trying to add to the gender equality discussion who is standing up for the good-hearted, honorable man that loses his scholarship, his job, or worse yet, his children, because he's accused of something he absolutely did not do. Men are roughly 78% of all suicides throughout the world. And I would counter with, but women attempt suicide more often. So It's not a contest, but I kept making it into one. Why couldn't I simply learn about men's issues and have compassion for male victims without jumping at the opportunity to insist that women are the real victim? For years of researching and fact-checking what the men's rights activists were telling me, there is no denying that there are many human rights issues that uniquely or disproportionately affect men. paternity fraud uniquely affects men. The United States Selective Service, in the case of a draft, still uniquely affects men. Workplace deaths, disproportionately men. War deaths, overwhelmingly men. Suicide, overwhelmingly men. Sentencing disparity, life expectancy, child custody, child support, false rape allegations, criminal court bias, misandry, failure to launch, boys falling behind in education, homelessness, veterans issues, infant male genital mutilation, lack of parental choice once a child is conceived, lack of resources for male victims of domestic violence. So many issues that are heartbreaking if you are the victim or you love someone who is the victim of any one of these issues. Before making the Red Pill movie, I was a feminist of about 10 years, and I thought I was well-versed on gender equality issues. But it wasn't until I met men's rights activists that I finally started to consider the other side of the gender equality equation. It could serve as a rung on the ladder, bringing us all up to a higher consciousness about gender equality. The film was released in theaters, and articles and critic reviews started to roll in. And that's when I experienced how engaged the media is in groupthink around gender politics. And I learned a difficult lesson. When you start to humanize your enemy, you, in turn, may be dehumanized by your community. And that's what happened to me. Rather than debating the merit of the issues addressed in the film, I became the target of a smear campaign. And people who had never seen the movie protested outside the theater doors, chanting that it was harmful to women. It certainly is not. But I understand their mindset. I too would have protested the screenings or at least signed the petitions to ban the film because I was told that they were my enemy. I was told that men's rights activists were against women's equality. But all the men's rights activists I met support women's rights.
Say Lo's pregnant.
Lo's pregnant!
Lo's pregnant.
Wait, he's pregnant too! No!
Just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. Just dreading going to work in the morning. And every day I would wake up and I just really have this weight on me because, like I told you, I was having to counsel people. It's a very, when you realize finally that, again, this embryo is a life. And why am I in charge of this? And why, again, I felt like we were starting to treat embryos as a commodity. I felt just not wanting to be involved in it. And so as a result, I think it really, for me, it was my conscience, and it was the Holy Spirit for me to examine, my life, what I was doing, what my goal was. For some reason, we've all put it into our minds that IVF is the perfect cure, that we're going to have 100% chance of success. And we aren't in control, ultimately. Number one. Number two, it isn't perfect. Again, just like anything else, there are pros with everything and there are cons. And those cons can be short-term risks, but they can be long-term issues for the mom, let alone the possibility that for babies, we do know that there might be an increase in risk of things like birth defects in babies born after IVF and ICSI, which is a way to place sperm into an egg, for example. And which is a slight absolute risk, but a risk nonetheless. We know that there's a lot of data coming out now looking at this incidence of donor half siblings, and 50, tens to 20s of donor siblings that might be meeting now and falling in love. And what does that kind of ramification look like as we move forward with more and more of this technology being used, right?
In that case, there's a sperm donor. That man, his sperm is all these different places in terms of which eggs, it's turning into embryos with. And then there's different adoptive families, or there's not adoptive, but families that are maybe asking for the sperm donation. And you're saying in some cases, they're actually later on growing up and then finding each other, these children, once they're adults, and falling in love and not realizing that they're biological siblings.
Absolutely. I think it was an article in the LA Times, actually, that discussed this one specific donor, and there were 50 plus of his biological offspring that were in potentially close proximity to each other. And then again, discussing what does this mean?
You're right. They've changed it from conception, fertilization to implantation, like you're describing. And so in an in vitro fertilization, an IVF clinic, they're not even considering this a human life because it's not, he or she has not been implanted yet. So what is for frozen embryos, what happens to the million?
I think, again, it raises all of this ripple effect and the downstream issues that can arise from this. So certainly there's supposed to be a process where they're in storage afterwards. However, that storage costs money. And so the couple would then have to pay an annual fee to continue to keep those embryos stored. The other dimension of this is, what if that couple, you stop hearing from them, they move, something happens, and now here you have these embryos, what to do with them. And I think the default that most clinics do these days is that they just continue to keep them in storage. Okay.
And then the couple could just request destruction of the embryos at any point.
Yeah. But there can be side effects, like any hormone may increase the risk of blood clots in the blood vessels, unfortunately, and especially birth control pills. And the reason for that is it's ethinyl estradiol, which is a much more potent synthetic form of estrogen. And so as we take that and it gets metabolized through our liver, it can increase the production of clotting factors. And then that's the mechanism by which you can have an increase in risk. For example, there is a study that just came out quite recently showing that all forms of contraception, be it both combined with estrogen and progesterone or progesterone only, which many more women are using now, will slightly increase the risk of breast cancer. And so that was just published recently. There might be an increased risk. Again, the mood issue, there was a huge Denmark cohort study looking at almost 1 million women and showing that, unfortunately, from an age group of 15 up to, I believe, 30s, there is a statistically significant increase in the incidence of depression, which is double that in teens because their brains are so plastic. There's a lot of plasticity and neuronal connections developing, and this risk persists even after you stop it. And the same goes with suicidality. And when you think about this with the other pandemic that we're having right now, which is this teenage, really a mental health crisis for, I think, all ages. And in particular, we worry about it for the teens. I think it's quite concerning that so many of our girls are on contraceptives. I think they quoted that out of the 12 million teenage girls in the US, half of them are sexually active, and another half of them are on birth control pills. And so that's an order of millions that might be affected. It's crazy.